In the 1930s, there was some degree of stability within the Middle East. Like in Turkey and Persia, Ataturk and Reza Shah continued to develop secular nations, while brothers Faisal and Abdullah ruled in Iraq and Jordan. Ibn Saud ruled in Arabia, Ibn Yahya in Yemen, and Egypt had gained their independence. There were some changes in power during this time, like in 1933 Faisal of Iraq died, but he was peacefully replaced by his son Ghazi I, and all of these leaders had crushed rebellions in breakaway states, like the Kurdish Ararat Republic in Turkey or the Ilkwan in Saudi Arabia. Even the Europeans had ended the Syrian revolt, the Rif rebellion in Morocco, and the Italians had brutally pacified Libya. However, the world would be struck by the Great Depression. This weakened many of the newly modernizing states, but also pushed them into looking for further streams of income, notably in oil. And leaders across the Islamic world would watch events in Europe with some degree of hope, as Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy presented them with an alternative power who could potentially help in their bid for independence. For instance, over in Afghanistan, Mohammad Zahir Shah came to the throne with some trouble, but far more peacefully than anything beforehand. He also inherited a somewhat developed state and an army of 40,000 soldiers. But he was still young, so initially his uncle, Muhammad Hashim Khan, took over running the country. He quickly began aligning with the Nazis, and in 1935, German businessmen began appearing in the country. As his country began to grow richer, he had bold plans for across his eastern border. Their Muslim Uyghurs had risen up in China and formed the East Turkestan Republic. Zahir Shah sent some soldiers to protect their emir, Muhammad Amin Bugra. But this state became the center of much stranger political events. He, like many Republicans, had largely dropped the idea, but those who were still loyal to the House of Osman were still proving to be supporters of Pan-Turkism. So a Pan-Turkic state in Asia could lead to Ataturk's position being weakened internationally. He therefore decided to aid the Chinese government, and so too did the Nazis. The Soviets meanwhile had their own puppets in the region, and all the various ethnicities began to clash. There was even Tawfik Bey, who was a Syrian in the service of Ibn Saud, who seems to have joined in as well. The Japanese also sensed an opportunity and wanted to create their own puppet state. Many Turks already saw Japan as the future liberators of the colonized world, while some even saw the two nations as tied together under the Pan-Turanist umbrella, along with the Finns, the Hungarians, Koreans, and more. Inside Japan, exiled Turks formed the Idel-Ural Society alongside some Manchurians, and they found a new champion in the exiled Ottoman prince Abdul Karim. The Japanese planned on helping to install him onto the throne of a Turkic state in Xinjiang, which even Ataturk described as a Muslim Manchukuo. But the Soviets moved in quickly and installed their own puppet, and these plans were shelved. Japan's attention was of course focused elsewhere afterwards, and so too was Afghanistan's, who would in later years look towards taking parts of Pakistan. But over the border in Persia, Reza Shah had continued with his secular reforms. In 1935 at the Gorhashad Mosque, the clergy denounced his heretical rule, but they were crushed and Reza Shah pushed on regardless. And much like in Afghanistan, he too began to look towards the fascists. For instance, he only allowed Lufthansa Airlines to fly in Persian airspace, and the Italians trained his naval officers on board Italian ships that he had bought. He was also finally able to bring many of the old foreign-owned businesses under national control, like printing money was taken away from the British Imperial Bank. Foreigners were also banned from owning land and travelling to the provinces without permission. He, like all the leaders of the Middle East, still needed foreign money though. So when building the huge railway line from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, he chose investors who historically had no interest in the lands, like the Scandinavians, the Americans, and the Germans. His most drastic action though was to cancel the Darcy oil concession. His motives haven't necessarily been agreed upon, but it seems he just wanted to renegotiate the terms in the wake of dipping revenues during the Great Depression. Or he could have just been fighting back against the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which did engage in many practices that undermined the Shah. For instance, they sold oil to the British Admiralty for a discounted price, and this of course would limit his share of the money. So the terms were renegotiated, increasing his share in the profits from 16% to 20%, and Britain continued on extracting Persian oil. Yet throughout all of this, Nazi Germany quickly became Persia's largest trading partner by the end of the decade. And I really shouldn't say Persia anymore, as it was in this period that they changed their name to Iran. This name literally means the land of the Aryans, and Iranians had been referring to themselves and their lands as this for centuries. However, they only officially requested that their name be changed in the 1930s, and this could have something to do with the Nazis. Hitler, for instance, declared that Iranians were pure-blooded Aryans in 1936, and said that they were exempt from the Nuremberg laws. They founded a newspaper known as Iran Bastan, and hired many locals to spread their message, like Davud Monshazadeh, who even fought for the SS during the war. There were, however, still communists in the nation, despite the fall of the Persian Soviet in the north. Many of these, like Iraj Eskandari, had studied in Berlin, but he was arrested along with 52 other communists in 1938. Some of these men would die in prison in Tehran, while others were subject to show trials similar to Stalin's. Eskandari, though, would survive, and would later found the Tudeh Party. Moving further west in Turkey, Ataturk wasn't necessarily in favour of one alliance or another. Turkey was, after all, stuck between a group of countries all rearming and posing a threat to his nation. While at home, it's pretty hard to place Ataturk into a camp, be it communist, fascist or liberal. As he himself said, "I do not leave any verses, any dogmas, nor any frozen and moulded principles as spiritual heritage. My spiritual heritage is science and reason." As such, he embarked on a Soviet-style 5-year plan to modernize his country, but also gained praise from Hitler for his nationalist agenda. He also developed a one-party state, created a cult of personality, but also westernized his nation and pushed a secular agenda. So his foreign policy was often equally hard to pin down. At the beginning, he was close to the Soviet Union, who aided his wars against the Greeks, and they had signed a non-aggression pact back in 1925. But he began to fear Soviet designs in the east, so Ataturk turned west and made a deal with Mussolini in 1928. However, this came at a time when Ataturk's plans on Mosul had been stopped by the British. Mussolini then tried to extend this into an alliance with the Greeks, and relations were normalized in 1930. But the Turks then began to fear Mussolini and his possible plans on Anatolia. This was made worse when in 1933, Mussolini made a pact with the Soviets and later attacked Ethiopia. Ataturk was also skeptical of any dealings with the Germans, who had often asserted control over Ottoman troops in the last war. Yet he still accepted German technical advice and loans, and Germany became a major trading partner, but he tried to counteract this by inviting the British to invest and construct steel and iron mills. This way, no one country held a monopoly, and they couldn't pressure Turkey alone. Yet again, it should be said that Hitler was a keen admirer of Ataturk, allegedly saying, "Ataturk was the first to show that it is possible to modernize and regenerate the resources that a country has lost. In this respect, Ataturk was a teacher, Mussolini was his first, and I his second student." But this admiration was not reciprocal. Some of Ataturk's later reforms, though, continue to be praised by the Nazis, like a campaign to force all of the citizens of the country to speak Turkish. Or in 1934, there was a resettlement program which aimed at Turkifying every province in the nation. As Sukrukaya said, "This law will create a country speaking with one language, thinking in the same way and sharing the same sentiment." The many Muslim migrants and refugees from the Balkans were then spread thinly around the provinces, so they'd lose their unique identities. For instance, many Bulgarian Muslims had settled in Thrace, and therefore the Bulgarians could claim this territory later on. However, if they were spread out among all of Turkey, they could not do so. Also, by splitting up the Kurds and other groups, they'd stop further rebellions. But, of course, such nationalistic policies had their own problems, like it prompted pogroms in Thrace. Supposedly, the local governors thought the new program intended to break up the Jewish populations as well, and in such a climate, pogroms began, forcing 15,000 to flee the region. Yet, internationally around the same time, Ataturk turned towards the Allies, and along with the Greeks, they proposed creating a Mediterranean pact. At this point, the Mosul question had already been settled, Ataturk had signed a treaty with the French in 1926, and Turkey joined the League of Nations in 1932. The Allies then signed the Montreux Convention, allowing Turkey to remilitarize the Straits, and this helped keep the Turks on their side as the Nazis grew in power in Europe, but it angered the Soviets. Ataturk therefore wanted to finally secure his western border with the Balkan Entente, which was signed with Greece, Romania and Yugoslavia. This was specifically targeted against Turkey's old ally Bulgaria, who were beginning to rearm and look towards possibly reconquering lost lands. Yet, Ataturk, knowing that the Allies were determined to keep him on their side, was actually able to make some gains in the south around Hatay. This land he described back in 1923 as a homeland where Turks lived for centuries and can't be a captive at the hands of an enemy. But to understand this situation, we need to look at Syria. Here, the French had, in 1923, managed to agree to a constitution with many nationalist leaders, like Hashim al-Atassi and Ibrahim Hanunu. The two sides then began to negotiate independence, but one that would be very gradual and would allow the French to keep the Syrian mountains. However, in 1936, Hanunu died, and the nationalist bloc held commemorations for him. The French responded to this by arresting many of their leaders, which in turn led to the Syrians going on strike. Soldiers then fired at the crowds and arrested over 3,000 people. By this point though, within France itself, left-wing groups were growing more powerful and demanding an end to colonialism, or at least a change in their methods. It would in fact only be a couple months later that the Popular Front headed by Leon Blum would come to power. They invited al-Atassi to discuss independence again, and they agreed that his national bloc would achieve it gradually and maintain some sort of control over the Druze and Alawite states. Atassi returned home a hero as the first true president of the Republic, but this was short-lived. The French were now too worried about Germany, so delayed ratifying the treaty. This led to condemnation from many old Syrian nationalists, like Abd al-Rahman Shah Bandar, causing rifts in the national bloc. And to make matters worse for them, this is when the Hatay issue was brought up. The population of the province at this time is estimated to have been around 46% Arab, 39% Turkish and 11% Armenian, with the rest being Circassian, Kurds and Jews. In 1936, two Syrian Arabs won the elections, as Turks and Arabs fought one another in the streets. Ataturk then appealed to the League of Nations, and again, the Allies gave in to his requests. They prepared for a new constitution and held a referendum in 1939. Many, however, call this completely rigged, as the Turks sent tens of thousands of people from their own country to vote in it, while the French largely let it happen. Al-Atassi resigned in protest, thousands began demonstrating, but the annexation went ahead and Hatay became part of Turkey. But it was not Ataturk who celebrated this, as he died in 1938 and was replaced by İsmet İnönü, who continued leading the country down much of the same path. The Syrians though had now lost land, and it had been confirmed that they would not unite with Lebanon, as they had signed a similar treaty with France, paving their way to independence. Here the situation was more stable for the French, as Charles Debas had been president from 1926 to 34. And as a pro-French Greek Christian, he continued to work alongside them. He appointed Maronites like Emile Ede and Bechara al-Khoury to be prime minister, often switching between the two. And when there were challenges to this setup, like when Mohammed al-Jazir ran for president in 1932, the French just cancelled the constitution and Debas continued in his role. Emile Ede would take over the country from 1936 to 41, and he had fought with the French during the last war, and again, just continued working alongside them. He, like many, did push for independence, albeit a very gradual one, and an independence free from the ideas of Arab unity. In fact, for decades, Christians in Lebanon had been at the forefront of Arab nationalism, but in recent years they were pushing forward the idea that they were the descendants of the Phoenicians and were very different from the Arabs. 1936 though proved to be a crucial year elsewhere in the Islamic world, and as I explain it, it's important to bear in mind the aspirations of the Italians and the Germans. The Italians in particular were looking to reclaim lands all over the Mediterranean as part of Mare Nostrum, and in 1935 they launched their invasion of Ethiopia. Mussolini though had tried to position himself as almost a saviour of Islam, even though he had killed thousands in Libya. Yet in Tripoli a couple years later, he would be given the Sword of Islam by Yusuf Kerisk, a Berber supporter of his. Inside the city a monument was also built for him, with the description reading, "To Benito Mussolini, peacemaker of the people, redeemer of the land of Libya." He, like other right-wing leaders like Hitler and even Franco, were remarkably fond of Islam in general, and could always use their friendship to undermine the Allies. But Italian expansion in particular worried the Egyptians, who were being ruled by Ismail Sidki. He was sort of a dictator as he suspended the constitution, but he was forced to resign in 1933, and once again power switched hands, and after intense protests, the constitution was brought back in. Yet in 1936, King Fuad died, and his young son Farouk came to the throne. His father was actually quite keen on forming an alliance with the Italians, but now the young Farouk was actually studying in Britain when his father died. With him in power, the British again began to negotiate the Treaty of 1922, extending the time that their troops could remain to defend the Suez Canal. And fortunately for the British, as Italy invaded Ethiopia and claimed Egypt and Sudan, this even pushed the nationalist Wafd Party into making a deal. Many did protest this, but over 100 people were killed and the treaty was still signed. It allowed the British to remain around the canal, inside Sudan, and in times of war, they could use Egyptian airspace, ports and roads for the next 20 years at least, while Egypt builds an army capable of defending the canal by themselves. There was, however, yet another emerging power in Egypt. This began with Ahmad Hussein, who was angry that the fez was produced abroad. He tried raising money to build a factory in Egypt himself, and he promoted yet another form of nationalism, and his group, Young Egypt, modelled itself on European fascism. His followers in their green shirts paraded in the streets and allegedly received Italian funding. And in these early days, a young Gamal Abdul Nasser joined the party before they were banned. Hussein, though, had his own unique ideologies. He believed that Egypt should return to true Islamic society, when there was no employer and no employee, but all were brothers cooperating together. He actually believed Hitler had managed to achieve this, but later said Hitler is a madman who wishes to destroy the world in order to satisfy his arrogance and his desires. Regardless, Britain had signed a deal with Egypt and France with Syria. Both of these came in 1936, and that same year there would be a coup in Iraq. To understand this, we need to look at the Simele massacre, which targeted the Assyrians in the north in 1933. The Assyrians had already angered many Muslims back in 1924 when they committed a massacre of their own in Kirkuk, and as they had long worked with the British, they were seen as agents of empire, and possibly looking to divide the country. Well, in 1932 the British granted Iraq their independence, but again retained military bases and control over the Assyrian troops, some of the best soldiers in Iraq. Shamun Ashai, the patriarch of the Catholic Assyrians, tried to gain autonomy before the British mandate ended, but failed. So many leaders within the Assyrian levies, like Malik Yaqub, convinced his followers to deny Iraqi citizenship. The new Prime Minister, Rashid Ali al-Gaylani, invited the patriarch to meet with him in Baghdad, but arrested him as soon as he arrived. Gaylani, by the way, had joined with other prominent leaders, like al-Hashimi, to form the Party of National Brotherhood. They were opposed to any concessions to the British, and Gaylani would later try to turn Iraq into an Axis power. Yaqub and his band of followers then tried to flee to Syria and clashed with the Iraqi forces near the border. No one really knows who started the attack, but the Iraqis jumped at the chance to spread stories of Christian atrocities, including the poisoning of drinking water. Bakir Sidki then led troops north, and in August 1933 around Duhok, his troops began massacring the Assyrians. Nearby Kurds, Yazidis and Arabs joined in looting the towns, as most Assyrians fled to the town of Simele. There they persuaded the Assyrians to disarm, before the Iraqis fired among them until not a man was left standing in the shambles. Men were dragged out and shot or bludgeoned to death, and their bodies thrown on a pile of dead. King Faisal died shortly after the massacre, so the following celebrations held in Mosul were attended by his son Ghazi, who handed out decorations to the participants. Ghazi, by the way, was an open pan-Arab nationalist, and again would be keen on dealing with the Axis. The British, meanwhile, were seen as betraying the Assyrians in favour of appeasing the Iraqi government, which by now was also anti-British. Otherwise, an Iraqi historian named Kenan Makiya argued that this massacre was the peculiar origin of a sort of Iraqi nationalism. This is because Kurds, Sunni Arabs, Yazidis, Shia Arabs, Republicans, monarchists and more all united to stamp out the Christian Assyrians. However, this seems far too simple, as within 2 years, the Kurds, Yazidis and the Shia would rebel. Well, the Kurds really just fought against themselves, but the Yazidis would rebel against conscription laws. Again though, Bakir Sidki arrived, and killed a couple hundred people and then imposed martial law. Then, across central Iraq, the Shia Muslims were feeling more and more excluded from politics and just generally ignored. After some small uprising, the Iraqi government arrested a prominent Shia cleric, causing the rebellions to spread further. They continued until late 1936, when, again, Bakir Siddiqui came in and crushed the fragmented tribes. By this point, the British were describing Siddiqui as the best commander in Iraq. However, he was a Kurd, and he promoted many Kurds to high-ranking positions. But despite all of his achievements, he began to feel slighted because he was not promoted even further. And although he often worked with the National Brotherhood Party, Iraq, like elsewhere, didn't have long-serving prime ministers. From the beginning of 1933 to the end of 1935, there was Naji Shawak, Al-Gaylani, Jamil al-Midfai, Ali Jawdat al-Ayubi, al-Midfai again, and finally al-Hashimi. Well, Siddiqui had been instrumental in toppling Ayubi, as when the Shia rebelled, they demanded his resignation. Siddiqui then refused to move against them until he agreed to leave office. Al-Hashimi would be appointed to help quell the uprising, and he began to transform into a dictator, ruling by decree, expanding the police and shutting down newspapers. But it was the fact that he didn't promote Siddiqui that proved to be his demise. Siddiqui moved into Baghdad when Hashimi was on a trip and forced other leaders, like Nouri al-Said, to flee to Cairo. However, he did make a crucial mistake in killing Jafar al-Askari. He was very popular in the army, having been an early leader in the Arab revolt, and with his death, many began to see this coup as anti-Arab, especially as the newly installed Prime Minister, Hikmat Suleiman, was a Turkmen. Siddiqui though held the real power, and he tried to emulate Ataturk and Reza Shah, and he was also set to become part of a huge Islamic alliance known as the Sabadat Pact. This was actually put forward by Mohammad Zahir Shah of Afghanistan and would stretch from Istanbul to Kabul, but it was only really possible with a Kurd in power in Iraq, as many of the Arab nationalists still had claims to lands in Turkey and Iran, like Khuzestan. So this was a sort of non-Arab Islamic alliance. Also, this military coup is said to be the first in modern Arab history, and would of course be followed by dozens more. But it didn't last very long. In August 1937 in Mosul, Siddiqui was assassinated. Yet the motivation behind it is disputed. Some claim it was Nouri and the British, others say it was angry army officers, but really there's dozens of groups who would want to get rid of him. The pro-British Nouri al-Said would eventually take over in 1938, however, many still demanded full independence from Britain. And within the country, Prince Grover convinced the king to send Iraqi officers to train in Germany. He even purchased a newspaper called the Arab World, broadcast Radio Berlin in Arabic, and translated Mein Kampf. All of this positioned Germany as the potential saviour of Iraq. So when the officers returned from Germany, fully convinced of this, 4 of the highest ranking officers formed the Golden Circle, and they would make a move for power. Meanwhile, over in Palestine, again in 1936, Britain was about to face its greatest challenge to date. Jewish migrants continued arriving and buying up land. Governor Warchup, the High Commissioner, warned that this would serve as a focus of discontent and might even result in serious disorders. But in his years in charge, he still allowed the Jewish population to increase from 175,000 to 325,000 between 1931 and 35. These Jewish people were divided into different groups, all with very different ideologies and even paramilitaries. There were still many Bolsheviks in Palestine, and they, along with the moderates, favoured a more peaceful policy with the Arabs, known as Havlagar. This was the doctrine of Haganah, the main paramilitary group, who favoured defence rather than attack, hoping to keep the British on side. But alongside them, there were also revisionist Zionists, who believed a Jewish state should also include Jordan, and they believed in Palestine only violence could establish a Jewish state. They had some supporters in Britain like the MP Josiah Wedgwood, who wanted Palestine to become a dominion like Canada or Australia. By the 1930s, their leader Jabotinsky had already been arrested by the British and barred from re-entering Palestine. Yet he still formed his own Zionist Congress to further these goals, and their activities were pretty global. Like the Batar movement was said to have around 40,000 followers in Poland, all training in military drills. However, their actions there are somewhat controversial. On the one hand, they helped defend Jews from many anti-Semitic attacks, but also they began to copy many aspects of fascism and even worked with some fascist leaders. For instance, they signed the Haavara Agreement with the Nazis in 1933. This allowed some 60,000 Jews to flee Germany to Palestine and bring some of their assets with them. Well, technically they could use the value of their assets to purchase German-made goods that would then be used to settle in Palestine. This, however, was met with condemnation, as it allowed the Germans to make money despite an international anti-Nazi boycott. Then in 1936, Jabotinsky planned on evacuating 1.5 million Jews from Eastern Europe and bring them into Palestine. The Poles, Hungarians and Romanians all agreed, but the British vetoed the idea, believing it would be disastrous to Palestine. Some, though, say that Jabotinsky predicted the Holocaust and tried to save as many Jews as possible. But then again, he also worked with Mussolini by setting up the Bataan Naval Academy in 1934 to train up Zionists. Yet they did break off relations with Mussolini when he joined Hitler in an alliance. Regardless, the arrival of huge numbers of Jews in Palestine and the development of cities broke down the old Arab clan system. Many Arabs flocked to the cities and largely lived in shanty towns. As resentment continued to grow, so too did organizations trying to mobilize the people, especially after the violence of the late 1920s. Tarab Abdul Hadi, for instance, created a feminist movement which included both Christians and Muslims. In a famous speech she said, "The mothers, daughters, sisters of the Arab victims are gathered here to make the world witness the betrayal of the British. We want all the Arabs to remember that the British are the cause of our suffering." A number of political groups also began to emerge, like the Independence Party in 1932, which was inspired by Gandhi and advocated for a boycott. However, these political parties were mainly the domain of the rich and the educated, and their parties were divided along old family lines who had contended for power for decades, like the Husseini family, who funded the Palestinian Arab Party. There was also the Khalidi family. They had remained loyal to the Ottomans during the war, and many of them served as mayor of Jerusalem, like Hussein al-Khalidi in 1934, who founded the Reform Party. After him came Mustafa al-Khalidi in 1938. He, however, was accused of being a Zionist himself when he said of the Jews, "They cannot be thrown into the sea." Likewise, some of them have bought land and received deeds in exchange for money, and we must recognize them. Plus, there was the Nashashibi Party. They once again had held power for centuries, being appointed guardians of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the 15th century. In modern times, Raghib al-Nashashibi founded the National Defense Party. Now, all of these groups largely had the same ideas, but these old familial ties divided them into different groups. Meanwhile, a Syrian preacher named Izz ad-Din al-Qassam formed the militant Black Hand Secret Society. This band of poor Arabs were then trained in fighting and also in virtues, like giving to the poor and praying regularly. As he built up his forces, some members like Abu Ibrahim al-Kabir wanted to speed up the revolt, and it seems that he just led some attacks on Jews beginning in 1931. As they ambushed a kibbutz and bombed others, al-Qassam waited, building up a force of around 500 men. Then they received news of an illegal shipment of arms arriving, which would then be sent over to the Haganah paramilitary. Al-Qassam believed this was the time to strike, but he had no support from any of the major political groups, and it is said that he only had a dozen or so rifles. But he gave a speech denouncing the British and disappeared into the hills. Shortly afterwards, a policeman was found dead near his base, so the British, in response, overran his position and killed him, angering many Arabs. That April, his followers shot a couple of Jews around Nabta, triggering Jewish demonstrations and revenge attacks, and then the violence just spread. Inspired by events in Syria, the Arab Higher Committee was formed, and they called for a general strike, and later they refused to pay taxes. This committee was founded by Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti, and it included many of his old opponents. But the British just ignored their demands, and this forced the Arabs to take up arms and attack British oil and train lines, along with Jewish settlements, burning down acres of farmland. In response, the British then just equipped Jewish units to join their forces and also their searches, where they arrested and tortured many, forcing even more to become rebels. The British even began to round up Arabs in the Auja al-Hafiyah camp. This in turn encouraged Arabs from abroad to join in the rebellion, like Fawzi al-Kawukji, who had fought against the French in Syria. Now, however, he was the leader of the Iraqi Society for the Defense of Palestine, and he led just a few dozen men across the border. There were other foreigners as well, like Hamad Saab, who led Lebanese troops, and Muhammad al-Ashma, who led troops from Transjordan. However, once again, internal divisions plagued the Arab cause, as the Grand Mufti began to grow wary of their power, and Fawzi slipped across the Jordan River and away. Otherwise, after some heavy fighting like at Nur Shams in June, the British were able to call on their Islamic allies in Jordan, Iraq and Saudi Arabia to pressure for a ceasefire, and Lord Peel was brought in to try and find some sort of solution. He, for the first time, brought up the idea of partitioning the lands, granting the Jews coastal towns, and leaving Jerusalem in British hands to maintain the rights of every religious group. However, this plan would result in 225,000 Arabs being forced out of their homes, something most in the British government refused to go along with, and, obviously, the Arab leaders and the revisionist Zionists rejected it. Plus, peace was broken in 1937 when the Arabs killed Louis Yelland Andres, an Australian commissioner who was also a Zionist. By now, though, the revisionist Zionists were forming their own large paramilitaries, like the Irgun, which would target both the Arabs and the British. Jabotinsky, along with other leaders like Robert Bitka, then ordered a huge strike on November the 14th, known as Black Sunday. A series of bombs across the region killed 10 Arabs, and from here on out, they would continue to bomb Arab neighbourhoods and markets. But the British still focused on ending Arab violence first. Many Arab leaders were arrested, while al-Husseini fled the country. The borders were then closed, more camps were opened, and they set up the Arab investigation centres to interrogate and often torture the locals for information. In fact, many of the early leaders of MI5 and Mossad were present here, like Roy van Zaslaini, who gathered a great deal of information. Troops were then brought in from Egypt, and they recruited even more Jews into their special night squads. Together they took over strongholds in Jerusalem and imposed collective fines on communities, leaving them in further poverty. This poverty was made even worse by the jihad tax that they had to pay to the rebels. In some cases, the British would just blow up entire villages as punishment, like Mi'ar in October 1938. When British soldiers were killed, there were instances of swift and cruel retribution. Like in Halhul, they locked civilians in cages in the sun, and in Al-Bassa, when soldiers struck a mine, they ordered the local men to board a bus, and that bus was driven across mines. With the rebellion now clearly failing, many Arabs joined the Nashashibi units, which fought against their fellow Arabs. As the name suggests, they were led by Raghib al-Nashashibi, who sought a leadership position once Husseini had fled. By 1939, though, most of the rebel strongholds had fallen, and it was clear that war would erupt in Europe. So, keeping the Arab nations on Britain's side was becoming crucially important. As Neville Chamberlain said, "If we must defend one side, let us defend the Jews rather than the Arabs." So peace talks began at the London Conference, and they published the White Paper. This rejected partition and limited Jewish migration. They even agreed Palestine would be given independence in 10 years. Many of the more moderate Arabs accepted these conditions, but a lot of Zionists were angered by the agreement, especially when there was a risk of further persecution in Germany. As MP James Rothschild said, "For the majority of the Jews who go to Palestine, it is a question of migration or of physical extinction." So the revisionist Zionists began to strike British buildings and Arab citizens once again. Jabotinsky even planned on starting a huge rebellion against the British, but when this didn't come, Avraham Stern formed his own unit, known as Lehi. They planned on training Jews in Poland with the help of the Polish government and sending them over to Palestine to forcibly take the country. But the outbreak of World War II ended this plan. Throughout all of this rebellion, much of the world watched on, and the rebels did have many supporters. But in Jordan, Abdullah had his own plans. He actually accepted the Peel Commission to partition the country, as the small Palestinian state would then be placed in a union with the king. People obviously protested against his leadership, and in Ajloun, Rashid al-Khuzai led supporters in open rebellion. It didn't last particularly long, as his position was bombed and he fled the country. Yet Abdullah would continue to be a very controversial ruler in the Arab world. Elsewhere, many Arab leaders met at the Bludan Conference in 1937. This was almost the first ever pan-Arab conference, with representatives from across the region condemning partition. But true material support for the Palestinians could well have come from Hitler and Mussolini. Now, this next bit is pretty controversial, but we know that Husseini, back in 1933, wrote to the German consul in Jerusalem and congratulated Hitler on his success. He wrote, "Muslims inside and outside Palestine welcome the new regime in Germany and hope for the spread of fascist, anti-democratic state leadership to other countries." He went on to say that Jewish influence was damaging everywhere and needed to be fought. Husseini's Palestinian Arab Party also established a youth corps modelled on the Hitler Youth, and from very early on, the British found Nazi weapons and money inside Palestine. Then, although the Germans were initially forcibly deporting Jews from Europe, in 1937 the German consul said, "A Jewish Palestinian state would create additional national power bases for international Jewry, such as, for example, the Vatican State for political Catholicism or Moscow for the communists." Mussolini, on the other hand, was both pro-Arab and pro-Jewish. It seems that he was looking for any ally in the region to counter British influence. As I mentioned before, he supported revisionist Zionists, but he also came up with a new plan that he thought could appease everyone, and that was to settle the Jews in Ethiopia. There, they would live near the Ethiopian Jews who had lived there for centuries, and the increased migration would lead to further development in Italian East Africa. But I must say though that many Arabs did outright deny Nazism, even those who saw them as potential liberators, like Shakib Arslan in Lebanon. He, for instance, said, "I do not care for Hitler, nor do I defend him or believe his ideology," and he came to see the Italians and Germans as just new colonists. However, there were genuine fascists. Like in Syria, Antun Sada created the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. He argued that Syria should expand into Lebanon, parts of Turkey and Iraq, but reject any ideas of pan-Arabism, arguing that Syria was a distinct race and a superior one. He, however, denied that he was inspired by European fascism, and his ideas that Syrians were somehow a superior group was not really a racial concept. As a Christian himself, he looked to unite all sorts of groups, and said of race, "Every nation comprises diverse racial groups, and none is the product of one race or one specific tribe." So his view of Syrians included historically the Phoenicians, Babylonians and more, and geography to him mattered a great deal more. Otherwise, in Iraq there was the Al-Matana Club, under the guidance of Fritz Grober. Some of their members, like Yunus al-Sabawi, translated Mein Kampf, and later held important positions in government. In his case, he was the Minister of Economics. On the other side of the political spectrum, the Palestinian Communist Party was still predominantly Jewish, but they did have some Arab members, like Mohammad Najati Sidki. He attended many of the communist internationals, like in 1936 in Moscow. There he met Khalid Bakdash of the Syrian Communist Party. But the two men argued because Bakdash refused to endorse the use of nationalism to advance a largely internationalist ideology. Sidki was then sent to Tashkent to see firsthand how the Soviet Union was able to stamp out nationalism among the Central Asians. Sidki, though, is an interesting character, and his actions bring up another event that divided the Islamic world somewhat: the Spanish Civil War. When Franco rebelled against the Spanish Republic, he was in Spanish Morocco, and brought tens of thousands of Moroccan volunteers with him to fight on the mainland. He then promoted the unity of Christians, Muslims and Jews in a holy war against non-believers. As Franco himself said, "Our war is a religious war. We who fight, whether Christians or Muslims, are soldiers of God, and we are not fighting against men, but against atheism and materialism." He also received the backing of Moulay el-Mahdi, who held the title bestowed to him by the Spanish, the Caliph of Tetuan. Franco even sponsored Muslims to go on the Hajj, and went on to promote the religious ties between Christians and Muslims through a romanticized look at medieval Muslim Spain or Al-Andalus. So thousands continue to fight for Franco, and this is when Sidki arrived, offering to raise an army to fight against Franco. But only a handful of people ever joined him, and even Arab papers like the Philistine supported Franco over communism. Many Spanish communists were also reluctant to have any help from Moroccans. Dolores Ibarruchi called them hordes of Moors, beastly savages drunk with sensuality who rape our women and daughters. though it should be said that Moroccans across Europe were often portrayed this way. Like in Germany immediately after the First World War, the French had occupied the Rhineland, and many of their troops came from the colonies. Their often exaggerated and usually discredited stories began to appear in the press, of wild Moroccans, Senegalese and more, assaulting countless women. This was known as the Black Horror of the Rhine, and it became international news, and a focus of the early Nazi Party, who sterilized many mixed-race children, known as the Rhineland Bastards. But sticking on Morocco, by the 1930s, some like Elal al-Farsi and Ahmad Belefrej were demanding their full independence. They founded groups like the Moroccan Action Committee, but the French just quickly exiled them. While over in Tunisia, Habib Bourguiba also began his rise. He joined the Nationalist Destor Party, led by Abdelaziz Talbi. He joined in protests against the French for holding Christian services in Carthage in 1930. Then when the French held celebrations for the 50th anniversary of the Protectorate, he published scathing articles in his paper, calling it a humiliation. But in 1932, the Tunisians were then split over the French granting them citizenship. Although this may sound good in theory, the nationalists argued that this was a ploy to wipe out Tunisian culture. He also began to grow impatient with the methods of the older members of the party, so Habib broke away and founded the Neo-Destor Party. The French though quickly arrested him and the other leaders, setting off protests across the country. This lasted for a couple of years until 1936, when Armand Guillon was brought in. To try and make peace, he released Habib from prison and sent him for talks in Paris with the new socialist government of France under Léon Blum. Guillon, by the way, was himself a socialist, and he tried to alleviate some of the economic burdens for the Tunisians, who were suffering from droughts and the larger depression. To do this, he introduced many socialist laws like the 8-hour workday, but again, the construction of schools raised more problems, as French was prioritized as a language. So still strikes continued, and Léon Blum's government would collapse in France. Realizing that no deals could be made in Paris, Habib returned and held a congress in 1937, focusing the party on a more revolutionary path. This policy gained even more support when, on the 9th of April 1938, the French fired at protesters, killing around 22 of them. This, you could say, marked the beginning of the Tunisian independence movement, and Tunisians still honour the day on Martyrs' Day. Habib though was arrested very quickly afterwards, but the French could not really quell the nationalist movements in North Africa now, like in neighbouring Algeria, where there was a new problem. Here it should be said that the Germans at this time were not the only people exporting anti-Semitism. As the French prefect of Oran argued, the Algerian Jews are not French, their customs are Oriental, strangers to the traditions of the French nation. Oran was also the base of a new fascist party known as the Latin Union. They argued that the settlers in Algeria, whether they were French, Spanish or Italians, were a superior race. Some speculate that they tried to instigate violence between the Muslims and the Jews. However, there's no real evidence of this. Regardless, in Constantine in 1934, there was some sort of confrontation between a Jewish man and some Muslims, although what exactly happened is still disputed. But in the end, 25 Jews and 3 Muslims were killed. One report describes a scene of utter desolation and horror, of Jewish girls with their breasts cut off, of little children with numerous knife wounds, and of whole families locked in their homes and burnt to death. And this rise of anti-Semitic attacks would continue across the region over the following decade or so. Although back at the beginning of the 20th century, Jews made up 20% of cities like Algiers, today there's only around 100 or so left in the entire country. Elsewhere, the rising fascist powers could have found allies in the Arabian Peninsula. Mussolini, for instance, continued trying to woo over Yemen, while Ibn Saud was moving further away from Britain. Yemen and Saudi Arabia, though, clashed a couple times, starting in 1931, when the Yemenis captured Narjan. Ibn Saud reacted and kicked them out the following year, pushing his domain south. But very little else is known about the conflict. There was a larger conflict in 1934 over the Emirate of Asir. The emir here had accepted Saudi authority, but the treaty was an uneasy one, and the Yemenis still claimed the territory. Reportedly, when the Saudis sent delegates to meet Yahya of Yemen, he said, "Who is this Bedouin coming to challenge my family's 900-year rule?" In 1934, Yahya finally made peace with Britain and had his rule recognised, allowing him to focus on claiming territories to the north. It was said he eradicated all those who opposed him in the border towns, prompting Ibn Saud to declare war in March. Once again, they took back Narjan and Hajara and quickly moved into Yemen itself. By May, they attacked Hodeidah and looked to move on to the capital of Sana'a. Yahya finally had to surrender, giving up claims on all Saudi lands. But the Great Depression had actually hit Saudi Arabia pretty hard. For instance, the number of pilgrims to Mecca and Medina halved. So they began to get a little more serious about searching for oil, as many of their neighbours had already done so. In nearby Bahrain, the Sheikh had signed concessions back in the 1920s, and in 1932, oil was struck. 400 barrels an hour were produced, and some of the first exports were shipped off to Japan. Or Qatar also struck oil in 1937 around Dukhan, convincing Ibn Saud to follow suit, granting concessions to foreign companies, including American ones. In 1938, they too struck oil at Dammam, and they could now produce up to 1,600 barrels a day. This began a long history of Saudi-American ties, and this relationship may well have kept the Saudis neutral during the war. After all, Saudi Arabia was a refuge for many Arab rebels, and the occasional Nazi like Grober. In 1939, Saudi emissaries also met with Hitler, but they were still a pretty impoverished nation, with an army that fought on camels. So for now, the ruler depended on subsidies from Western nations. Yet I should also say that the Japanese sent delegates to meet with the Saudis. Although nothing really came of it, one of their visits was notable as they witnessed an assassination attempt on the king. The assassins, though, were killed before further information could be gained, so what their motives were is not known. And this finally brings us to 1939, when Hitler invaded Poland and World War II began.